Today, the government has announced its plans to publish the nationalities of foreign criminals awaiting deportation by the end of the year.
Yes, Number 10 sources have claimed the Home Secretary Yvette Cooper ordered this overhaul of the system due to the poor quality of data. Apparently, although we don't know yet, Albanians, Romanians and Poles may well be among the worst offenders for crimes.
But we'll have to wait until the end of the year for that full report.
Shall we speak to James Price, who is a former Conservative advisor? James, a lot of people have been pushing for this data to be released, a detailed breakdown of crimes by nationalities. It's going to be controversial once it's released. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, it's well overdue. And I mean, I've spoken about this on X or Twitter or whatever we call it earlier on today, praising the Shadow Justice Secretary, Rob Jenrick, for really pushing this. I think he had an amendment a whole year ago, back when it was still the Tories in power pushing for this, and it was moribund bits of the old Tory party who said no. So it's a bit embarrassing in some ways that it's Labour who are now doing it, but I think that Rob Jenrick should get a lot of the credit for really pushing for this. As you say, it will be controversial, but I don't really think it should be that controversial. Certain other European countries have already done this sort of thing. You see that breakdowns by nationality for tax contributions, for welfare receipts, things like that in places like the Netherlands and in Denmark. And you can find some really interesting things there. So for certain people from certain countries, if they're American, if they're Japanese, if they're other Westerners, those migrants tend to contribute more, whether it's in taxes, and commit fewer crimes. But then we see people from other parts of the world committing more crimes and contributing less to the economy. That necessarily shouldn't be a surprise. There are countries that have better education policies. There are countries that have better, more compatible cultures with our own. So we shouldn't be surprised by these things. And I think that transparency is always the best medicine, and it will help us to craft a more sensible and serious migration policy going forward.
We have already seen some of this data through various freedom of information requests. We've been able to see some crime rates from some countries, but in a very patchy picture. Of course, Denmark is a country that has published these sorts of league tables for many, many years now. And it has been controversial in Denmark because it does show that migrants tend to have higher crime rates than native Danish citizens. There is a question mark, I suppose, from groups who will say, why would this be a helpful thing to do? How could it inform policy? I mean, are we going to see? Do we really think the government is going to change its migration policy off the back of this data?
It's a good question. I wouldn't trust this government to do anything sensible at any point. So the short answer would be no on that one. Well, firstly, on Denmark. Denmark is probably the only developed country, or certainly the only European country, that doesn't have any kind of horrendous populist parties or huge, terrible political strife tearing from either the far left or the far right. Not that those terms perhaps mean very much anymore. And the reason for that is that the centre-left sort of mainstream party in Denmark took immigration restrictionism, which is to say, keeping the level of migration quite low, making sure that people assimilated properly and that you only had people there who could be compatible and economically contribute. The centre-left party took all of that very seriously in Denmark, and as a result, their politics is a lot healthier. I dare say their economy is healthier than it otherwise would have been. And what we've actually seen in the UK, things have gone backwards. Someone like Neil O'Brien, another very good campaigning MP, has highlighted how I think HMRC has stopped publishing the data of tax contributions based on nationality. They've also stopped publishing various kinds of benefits that are paid out by nationality. And this stuff will definitely inform policy. If you're going to have a free trade deal with certain countries that might include free migration routes, that should be an important factor.
This video is sponsored by Saily. Saily is a brand new eSIM service app. What it does is get you a local SIM card that you can use when you're traveling, so you don't have to pay those crazy roaming fees just to send a text back home. They've got eSIM plans in over 160 countries and 8 regions, so pretty much wherever you're going, they'll be able to make sure you're connected. So how does it work? Well, all you've got to do is hit our link in the description to download the app. It will work on iOS or Android. Buy a plan, you can choose the best time frame for you, and then just install the eSIM on your phone. When you land at your holiday destination, you can activate your plan instantly. Saily eSIMs only ever have to be installed once, so when you go on your next trip, You just buy a plan for a new country, turn that eSIM back on, and just like that, you could be watching the GB News YouTube channel. You can be connected anywhere you go, and you don't have to deal with patchy Wi-Fi in your hotels. So get sorted for your next trip by downloading Saily using the link in the description below. And if you use our code NEWS at checkout, you'll get an exclusive 15% discount on us.
It might all be very well and good to have frictionless trade with a country, but actually, if you discover that the people coming there don't contribute a lot or commit more crime, that would be something that if I were still in government, I would want to know.
James, I mean, there's a lot of people out there, particularly on the left, who will think that it's even, racist to even want to see this data. Why would you want to see this data? What do you think it's going to prove? What are you going to do about it? But I think transparency has to be key. James Price, thank you very much indeed, former Conservative advisor. OK, well, we're joined by Professor of Criminology at Staffordshire University, James Treadwell. James, thank you very much indeed for your time. I mean, how do you expect this to go, these types of league tables? We don't know exactly how they're going to be broken down, do we? At the moment, we know by nationality crime statistics. Do you imagine it will be very detailed, that we'll know per crime which nationalities are committing the most? What do you expect?
I don't expect it to be particularly good data in the first instance. And you've got to remember, in some ways, although Yvette Cooper has now gone for this, in many ways, the government have been dragged kicking and screaming towards the position of identifying, essentially. And it is a big issue, particularly with the prison population as it stands, because around about 12% of our prison population, and that's gone up by about 3%, is now foreign national prisoners. And there's been a great deal of resistance at almost every stage, and a lot of allegation that in publishing the nationalities of offenders, in essence, you're opening the door to racism.
And yet there are countries that do this. Not many countries actually publish this sort of data. Big question marks there. But Denmark is one that stands out as a country that has been publishing this data for quite some time. It doesn't seem to have unleashed, radical forces within that country. In fact, quite the opposite, because it's been that centre-left government that runs Denmark that has stayed in power, perhaps because it hasn't been resisting these different things and has had a more open data approach.
I think this is the thing, and this is one of the cruxes of the matter in some ways. It's interesting, isn't it, that so often, kind of progressive, those who are progressive and liberal look towards Scandinavian countries as beacons of good practice, but they certainly haven't when it comes to immigration and nationality figures for those going through the courts. And I think one of the things that it throws up actually is the inconvenient fact that what you do tend to see, and this goes against much of the narrative that's been established for many years in countries like the United Kingdom, is that actually the levels of crime that are then tagged to those immigrant populations in Scandinavian countries tend to be higher. So they are disproportionately high. Now, of course, there are strong reasons for that, and lots of the reasons, if we start to unpack them, seem very, very obvious. I mean, for one, the people who tend to migrate, 70% of those arrivals into the UK, for example, through irregular migration are male. Now, if there's one golden rule for crime, it's that disproportionately it's a male activity. It's tied to being young and male. So the more young males that you have, the more crime that you're likely to encounter. So there's lots going on. And until we get transparency around the data, unpacking that in the detail of it, it's very,
I
very
think, James,
difficult.
I think it's the cultural element that will be the difficult thing, that people will want to sweep under the carpet, because men, yes, everyone's happy blaming men. People find it very hard to, talk about differences between, nationalities. The threat of being called xenophobic or racist is just so strong, isn't it? Do you expect that this actually could lead to a change in migration policy, or is it more likely to be swept under the carpet, do you imagine, if there are uncomfortable truths revealed?
I think I'm a realist. So my view is we need to get realistic about what the data is showing us. And I think even the data is likely to show us, as you highlighted, those that are being highlighted in the first instance are likely to be Albanians, Romanians, and Polish. Now, in many ways, that's a problem past and a reflection of recent years, where we've seen migration into the United Kingdom from essentially accession countries. The patterns of migration that we're facing now are changing. You know, we're talking much more about people who are coming from further outside of the European Union, and with that there will undoubtedly be associated problems. You know, one fact that isn't talked about very much, if we look, for example, at anti-Semitic hate crime over the course of a decade has risen 667%. Now, that's massive in a decade, you know, and I think it's very clear that some of the drivers of that have accelerated more recently with the changes, because while we might kind of think of, and we can look at the benefits of migration by all means, there is a dark side as well. You know, there are dark sides to globalization, and we do need to be honest about those.
That's a really important point that you make, James. I'm afraid we have run to the end of the segment, but thanks indeed for joining us. And I think that is something that we should be reflecting on more, perhaps. James Treadwell there, Professor of Criminology at Staffordshire University.